This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press, and it's a great collection of books about animal studies. The most recently published volume in the series is the collection Decolonising Animals, edited by Rick DeVos, which addressed a topic which I know will be of great interest to lots of listeners, and might actually be a topic we touch on in today's conversation. If you're writing about, thinking about, teaching about, or just interested in questions about decolonisation, I do encourage you to get hold of a copy. And unlike lots of academic books, books in this series are very accessibly priced. Also, I'll give a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Now today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Stacy Banwell. Stacy is an Associate Professor of Criminology in the School of Law at the University of Greenwich in London, here in the UK. Much of her research concerns gender and warfare. She's the author of Gender and the Violences of War and Armed Conflict, which was published open access by Emerald in 2020, and a co-editor of the Emerald International Handbook of Feminist Perspectives on Women's Acts of Violence. Today, however, we're going to talk about her 2023 Palgrave Macmillan monograph, The War Against Nonhuman Animals, a Non-Speciesist Understanding of Gendered Reproductive Violence. Welcome to the podcast, Stacey.
Hi Josh, thanks for having me.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So I think this can be split into two elements. So the first was the inspiration, and then there was the conceptual framework for the book. So in terms of the inspiration, Dr. Melanie Joy's conversation about carnism on the Ezra Klein podcast in 2018 was the inspiration for the book. During that conversation with Ezra, she says that more farmed animals are slaughtered in 1 week than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout human history. And at the time, I had to stop and rewind that and check that I'd heard correctly. But I was really interested in this idea of how is the slaughter of non-human animals different from the violences that take place during war or armed conflict? Or perhaps to put it another way, are there grounds for placing the slaughter of non-human animals in the context of war? And as you can probably gather from the title of the book, I make the case that it is necessary to view the killing of non-human animals as an act of war. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a bit more detail. One of the key things I think with my work is that existing research looks at the use of non-human animals during war. My argument is that war is being waged against animals in current society. And then in the conceptual framework, in terms of the conceptual framework, I did then draw on the work of Waddiwell, so his book, The War Against Animals, but also Kochi's article, Species War. And I think both of those offer philosophical discussions around this issue. But what I wanted to do in this book is offer operational, practical and legal guidelines for protecting non-human animals during war. So those were the two elements that sort of led to me writing this book and thinking about the themes that are contained in it.
Let me start with a question that I always ask of people who are using this framing of war against animals. How literal do you take that to be? Do you think humans are literally at war with animals?
Like Waddiwell, I found it quite compelling to draw on Carl von Clausewitz's understanding of war, which is this idea that war is an act of violence to compel our component to fulfill our will. And I think rather than seeing it as, or trying to compare it to war in the case of intrahuman violence, myself, drawing on others, focus on what's the objective of the violence rather than the means that are used to wage this war. So if we focus on the objective, which is the complete domination or trying to compel the enemy to fulfill your will, then we can argue that the current treatment of non-human animals falls within this understanding. What I do in the book, and I had some reservations about doing this, but I do look at the statistics in relation to the number of non-human animals that are killed, not just in the UK, but globally, to sort of support that argument that if we take this interpretation of war, this idea of complete domination, we're looking at the objective rather than the means, then we can make the case that we are currently engaged in a war against non-human animals. I think because in the book I focus on specific elements, so I focus on war crimes and crimes against humanity, I think that helps to support the case further because I'm looking at specific acts of violence in the book. And these are acts that take place during the context of non-international armed conflict. And as you know, Josh, in the book, I sort of unpack this and provide my own revised understanding of what we mean by non-international armed conflict.
So what advantages are there, either for us as scholars or activists or for animals, to framing this violence as war?
I think for me, looking at the various international instruments that are contained within international humanitarian law, it felt as though there were good remedies there that would help to protect non-human animals. So that if we start to frame it like this and see non-human animals not just as victims but as civilians, and we look at these existing laws that protect non-combatants during war and armed conflict, I felt that that would work as a way to try and protect non-human animals. So as I say, I look particularly at certain instruments in international humanitarian law, and I felt that they offered practical remedies for trying to sort of protect non-human animals, but framing it in this context of war, I think helps to relay the gravity of what we're talking about here, and that's why I found it helpful to frame it in this context. It's also based on my previous research that I'm familiar with some of these treaties and some of these laws, but I think, I wanted to get across the gravity, but also perhaps by demonstrating that non-human animals fall within the criteria of these different instruments, it would help people to change their understanding of non-human animals and to see them as sentient beings who should be afforded similar protections to humans.
Yeah, so let's get into some of these particular protections, because one of the things, or the main thing you're focusing on in this book, is gendered and reproductive violence against animals. So could you explain, first of all, why you chose to focus on those set of violent actions, first of all, but then also introduce us to the kinds of violence that you're talking about here?
There are a number of reasons why. I think one is that I have already done research on these issues. So the types of violence we're talking about here. So reproductive violence is violence that is directed against an individual based on their reproductive capabilities. So some of the examples that I've looked at in my research before include things like forced sterilization, castration, forced pregnancy. So I was familiar with these crimes that take place in the context of war and armed conflict. And then I think through researching what takes place within the animal industrial complex, I felt that a case could be made to say that non-human animals are also subject to these crimes. So I was already familiar with those crimes. One of the crimes that I look at in the book is forced pregnancy. And there are three elements contained within that crime. And one of the things that I found through my research was that if we think about dairy cows and we think about their experience, I was able to sort of trace the three requirements that are required for that crime, which is classed as a crime against humanity. It's classed as a war crime. I was able to demonstrate that dairy cows are subject to those elements. And one of the things that I found is that recently Amnesty International, in their analysis of the crime of forced pregnancy, argued that we should perhaps move away from gender-specific language and use gender-neutral language. So they argued that the crime of forced pregnancy, in the past, we've always talked about that in relation to women, but they have suggested we now use the phrase pregnant persons or anybody capable of becoming pregnant. And so that aligned with my research, because I'm arguing that we should be applying legal personhood status to non-human animals. So then I was able to argue that if we adopt this gender-neutral language, we can argue that dairy cows who are subject to artificial insemination and all the processes that take place within the dairy industry, they can qualify for that particular crime. And then I was interested in, a lot of research has already looked at the experiences of female non-human animals. I was interested in looking at male non-human animals. And that's something that I've done in my other research, where there has been a tendency to use the term gendered analysis of war, and actually what people do is focus on women and girls. So in my other research, I had included the experiences of men and boys. And I wanted to do a similar thing here, to argue that male non-human animals are also subject to reproductive violence. And so the way I frame it in the book is that I look at persons capable of becoming pregnant, so that applies to non-human animals, and how that makes them vulnerable and susceptible to certain acts of violence. And then in relation to non-human animals, I was interested in looking at persons capable of procreation through semen production, and how that then leads to their vulnerability. So essentially what I was doing was looking at how gender and this idea of the reproductive body, and how that meant that both humans and non-human animals are targeted for these acts of violence. And because I had done this research on human populations, I was able then to sort of transfer some of that and consider the situation of non-human animals, and argue that once we remove and adopt a gender-neutral language, and if we see non-human animals as sentient beings and apply this idea of legal personhood, we can then see that non-human animals meet the criteria that is required for those particular crimes.
Could you give some examples of the way that males or semen-producing bodies are targeted by gendered violence?
Sure. Are you talking about human or non-human populations, or both?
Well, that's a good question, because that's what I was going to get to. It's this point about, I know you're not trying to compare them, but you are putting them side by side. So I was quite interested in what you were doing there methodologically.
So I think one of the main things that I wanted to do was broaden the relationship between gender and vulnerability. So in the past, we've always seen female bodies perhaps as more vulnerable. But what I wanted to demonstrate was, I wanted to focus on any bodies capable of reproduction through semen production, and how they might be targeted. So I looked at cases of human violence where men are victims of castration, there's injury to the testicles. What we see in some of these examples is the vulnerability of the penis. So I looked at certain examples like the 1971 Liberation War in Bangladesh, the genocide in the former Yugoslavia and Darfur. So I look at how men are targeted in those instances. And then I look at the way in which male calves are castrated within the animal industrial complex. I look at the forcible removal of semen from bulls, and argue that, again, these bodies are targeted because of their reproductive capabilities. As I said, I've looked at war crimes and crimes against humanity. The particular categories that I look at are rape, forced pregnancy, and any other acts of sexual violence. And so these violences that I look at in relation to men, so the castration, the genital harm, these all fall under this idea of any other acts of sexual violence. So what I was demonstrating in looking at both examples was that these bodies, what they represent, their reproductive capabilities, are what lead them to be victims of these acts of reproductive violence. So as you say, I'm very clear in the book that I want to avoid the dreaded comparisons that people have engaged in the past. But the point for me is that I really wanted to demonstrate these shared sources of oppression between human and non-human animals, and that anybody, whether human or non-human, who is regarded as subhuman or inhuman, they are then subject to this violence as well. So it's the status as non-human, if you like, that has led the violence against both groups. And that's what I was trying to really get across, that speciesism and the violences aren't just something that affect non-human animals, that they affect both populations. So that was my thinking there, was to try and demonstrate how gender, the reproductive body, can impact both of those populations.
How have you found the response to these kinds of placing side by side? Because you're talking about some appalling violence against humans, some of the most disturbing things that we do to each other, and then putting it next to something that, 98% of our colleagues, our friends, our family actively support.
The response has been good because I think I've gone to great lengths. I think, in the beginning of the book, I spend quite a bit of time in the first chapter outlining how this has been done where people are drawing direct comparisons. And then I demonstrate in the chapters where I do discuss these things that actually the key issue that I'm looking at is these shared sources of oppression, not saying that these acts of violence are the same or that we can make comparisons, but they emerge from the same sources of oppression. And I think because I deal with it head on and do provide that comparison of individuals who have engaged in those direct comparisons, I'm hopeful that it will be well received. And in fact, one of my friends shared, I'm not on Twitter, but one of my friends shared a post from someone who'd said that they were really excited about the book and that they were going to put it on their reading lists, and it actually was going to replace existing work which they had found problematic, that had fallen into this trap. So it was something that was very much part of the review process for the book. And then obviously something that I thought about and had friends and colleagues read over chapters before it was submitted for publication. But I would hope that people will see the clear difference between these analogies that other people make and what I'm trying to do here, which is to really focus on these shared sources of oppression, which is racism, gender, and speciesism, that inform the violences against both of these groups. So that's the intention, is this shared source of oppression, as opposed to let's compare these acts of violence. But I think because I'm arguing that we're currently engaged in a war against non-human animals, and I'm applying these particular war crimes and crimes against humanity, as I say in both of those chapters, I had to establish both the nature and the target of this violence. And so to do that, I had to sort of outline, okay, this is the nature of the violence. It involves this. And that's why I use the examples of intrahuman violence. And then I explain the targets, which are any male bodies or female bodies that have these reproductive capabilities. And then I go on to explain that how I think non-human animals qualify. So I think that's the intention, that in order to apply the situation to non-human animals, I felt it was important to establish the nature and target of those acts of violence. And also because we historically have only applied war crimes and crimes against humanity to human populations, I felt it was necessary to unpack that before arguing that we can apply it to the situation of non-human animals.
Throughout the book, I was thinking about the various ways that we engage in reproductive control over non-human animals beyond animal agriculture, which of course is your focus. And I was really intrigued in the conclusion that you have this nod towards the use of contraception to control squirrel populations, which is something that's very much in the news here in the UK at the moment. So do you think that any interference with animal reproduction might constitute a war crime?
I think in that instance, I argued that it falls under the idea of reproductive coercion, where you're controlling the outcomes of a person's reproductive autonomy. So I think in that instance, it's an example of reproductive violence and reproductive coercion. One of the key things that I talk about in the book, and it's something that I've been working on since writing the book, is one of the things with war crimes and crimes against humanity, not all of them, but is this idea of confinement, of keeping animals confinement, and the fact that if we think about factory farming, the ways in which animals are kept. So it's a slightly different issue, I would argue, with the grey squirrel, but I still think we can class this as an act of reproductive violence or reproductive coercion, because the issue again is the lack of consent on the part of the non-human animals. So it's slightly different in that case, but in the cases throughout in the book in relation to factory farming, I think this element of confinement, it underscores the war crimes and crimes against humanity that I'm talking about there. But I do think that yes, in that instance, we are still talking about reproductive coercion, reproductive violence, and this issue of a lack of consent.
How do we end the war against non-human animals?
That's a very good question. And interestingly, that's one of the questions that I end the book with. I provide 3 sort of questions as to how we can end this carnist battlefield, as I describe it. One is this idea of recognizing that non-human animals are sentient beings. The other is this argument around legal personhood. But I think for me, the issue is trying to link the violence against non-human animals to the violence that is committed against humans. So one of the things that one of the main themes of the book is this idea, and it's one of the things that I end with really, is this idea that it is white supremacy, human exceptionalism, racism, sexism, speciesism, all of these things are the sources of the violences that I discuss in the book. So it's not just a case of ending the violence against non-human animals, it's tackling all of those systems of oppression that inform the violences against all of those populations. So that's one of the things that I try to sort of get across, that if we can challenge human exceptionalism and the kind of its relationship to all of those other things, I believe that we can then end violence against anybody that we have deemed less than human. And that will include certain individuals within the human population, and that includes non-human animals. So that's how I try to approach it in the end. And I think it's another way of demonstrating how that I've been trying to not make comparisons here, but focus on the source of this violence. And to tackle it, it means tackling all of those issues.
Now, Stacey, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am, yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, it was Carol Adams' The Sexual Politics of Meat.
That's a very common answer to that question. You might not be surprised to hear. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, it was a conference paper at the British Society of Criminology conference in 2021. And the title of that paper was Which Bodies Matter? A Review of Sexual, Coerced and Reproductive Violence Committed Against Non-Human Animals.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Oh, gosh, this is hard. I would say Manisha Decker.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I think this is hard because not all disciplines will have this as their focus. So I think practically what would help is because all academics will have meetings, will have various events. So perhaps one way is to introduce more vegan focused events, so have vegan catering, because I think perhaps the best way to get people on board is through experience. So if people can experience good vegan food, that might help to sort of people to switch to a plant-based diet, perhaps. So that would be my suggestion that could apply to sort of academics broadly, that perhaps some more vegan catered events at universities.
Yes, good. And do you think there's something in particular criminologists can do?
Well, certainly in criminology, we could add more of this stuff onto the curriculum. So I do some of this stuff in my teaching, but we could certainly, when we're talking about green criminology, or we're looking at anything to do with criminology in the International Criminal Court, for example, we could include more things around vegan criminology.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think to change the hierarchical nature of this relationship, and as I mentioned in the book, to recognise that speciesism has implications for both human and non-human animals.
And what are you working on next?
So the next project is a book called, this is looking at an intersectional analysis of climate change and atrocity crimes. So in this book, I will revisit some of these issues about the benefits of non-human and environmental rights to personhood, and how that will also help to alleviate the causes and consequences of climate change.
And how can people find out more about your work?
So I'm on ResearchGate, academia.edu. You can always look at my staff webpage at the University of Greenwich. But what I think would be great is if people went to YouTube and they could have a watch of the animation that I created that accompanies the book. The title of that animation is Why is the War Against Nonhuman Animals a Crisis for Humans Too? And that's on YouTube.
Well, thanks so much, Stacey, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and we're just at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, and I'm on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do tell others about us and review the podcast where you found it. And if you're teaching at the moment, why not include some of our episodes on your reading list for students to listen into? I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.